So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today, Developing Career Ladder Pilots in Ontario. This webinar is hosted by Janine Anukata from the Literacy Network of Durham Region, as well as Tamara Katari from Literacy Link South Central and Stuart Callio from Literacy Northwest. My name is Amber Hawes, and I'm the Senior Communications and Marketing Lead at Essential Skills Ontario. So before we get started, I just want to give you a few instructions. So at the right-hand side of your screen is your GoToWebinar dashboard. There you can chat with each other in the chat pane and ask questions. If it's a technical question, just type it in and I'll try my best to assist you. If you have any questions about the content of the webinar, feel free to type them in the chat pane, and I'll ask our hosts throughout the webinar as well as at the Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, Janine, I will pass it over to you to get started.
Thanks very much, Amber. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for spending some time with us today to go over this PowerPoint and to hear a little bit about our experiences as pilot sites related to career ladders. As Amber mentioned, I'm Janine Agnew-Kata. I'm the Executive Director of the Literacy Network of Durham Region, and I'm joined today by Stuart Callio, who's representing Literacy Northwest, and Tamara Katari from Literacy Link South Central. Between the three of us, we're regional literacy networks that are covering the areas of the regional municipality of Durham, Thunder Bay, Kenora, Rainy River, as well as Oxford, Elgin, Middlesex, Brant, Haldimand, and Norfolk. So we're situated in the north, central, and western region of the province. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about career ladders. It's a bit of an overview, largely of the second phase of career ladders, but we'll touch on the first phase as well. All three of us represent the three pilot sites that were supported by Essential Skills Ontario to investigate the feasibility of career ladders in the province of Ontario. And most of you who are on the call have probably heard about the first phase being completed and are curious about the second. So I'm assuming that most people are familiar with the basic overview of career ladders, but we'll go over that as well. Oops. So before we begin, I think Amber's already covered this. As you know, you're muted. If you do have questions, please type them in the pane and she will address them. We do have a question and answer period scheduled for the end, so you're able to ask questions of any of the three pilot sites, whatever you might have on the mind related to the three areas we did this in. So please hold your questions to the end unless you have something pressing, and then Amber will take care of forwarding that question to us during the broadcast. This webinar is being recorded. So what are career ladders? Some of you, as I mentioned, have heard of this initiative before, and there's kind of a long history of how Essential Skills Ontario became involved and how our pilot sites got involved. But essentially, this pilot has been underway since 2013. We're going to go over the key initiatives, activities, successes, lessons learned, and challenges over the first two phases, of which we're now completing the second. One of the things that I'd like to start off by talking about are the characteristics of what a career ladder is. So this might be an overview for many of you who sat through the first phase webinar. Essentially, this is a project or initiative that is directed towards the interest of assisting the working poor or the precariously employed, really focusing on individuals who are having difficulty getting traction in the workplace because of a lack of training, formal education, and other types of issues of marginalization. The model of the process largely comes from the United States. My introduction to career ladders as an initiative really came through an introduction to other types of models that are existing throughout the U.S., including Port University in the San Francisco area, and different types of work in Chicago and Wisconsin that are related to this initiative. And we covered that in the first phase of the project, and that first phase webinar talked a little bit more about the history. At this point, the process is really in the developmental area in Ontario. But to go over just the key aspects of it, Career Ladders addresses the needs of the working poor, the precariously employed, by offering training opportunities that have been condensed or chunked into smaller sizes. So these are training opportunities that are compressed and take place over shorter periods of time in a way that meet the needs of the working poor, in so much as the credentials are broken into what we would consider to be more obtainable units, and they're more related to specific occupations as opposed to being generic training. The content tends to be customized around the needs of particular sectors, which is a key feature of career ladders. And the training is obviously more geared towards the needs of employers and employees and workplace-friendly modules. Career Ladders includes the wraparound supports of a variety of community and social service agencies that help additional barriers for the clients who are involved. And if I can just sort of talk briefly about what this looks like on the ground in those models where this is functioning as a kind of fully in-process model, you're assisting people who are not able to access reasonable occupation or employment opportunities by placing them in an employment situation and then allowing them to access training over short durations that is specific to whatever sector they're working in. So Career Ladders tends to be something that is above and beyond your typical workplace training. There are particular objectives that are attached to Career Ladders. It's certainly meant to be flexible to specific communities' needs. So it is not something that is a model that isn't scalable. It's extremely portable to any community that would like to offer it. It tends to differ from other training methodologies because of the structure and because of the principles that it adheres to. So going back to the previous slide, we're talking about offering employment opportunities or training opportunities to individuals in particular sectors in a way that meets the needs of their particular sector or occupational need and the needs of their employers. But on top of it, it addresses things like program alignment with industry and economic development. So we know in each community there are particular sectors or areas of the economy that need to be developed, and Career Ladders is meant to conform to the needs of that, the industry or economic needs of that particular community. The key outcome is to increase the participation of low-income or low-skilled workers. So we're attempting to help people who would otherwise find it difficult to access the training in their community that would lead them to occupational success. Very often what we find throughout our own experience is that the individuals who might be interested in Career Ladders are those who have less of an opportunity to spend long periods of time in training. And this is where the issue around accelerated learning and skill building comes in. You're providing people with an opportunity to kind of condense their training around very specific goals. So everything becomes kind of more meaningful at a community level. One of the interesting aspects that we have had discussions with in our communities about is the fact that these learning outcomes are stackable. So you can take a series of modules or certificates and stack them up to something like a college diploma over time. Again, this meeting the needs of the working poor who are having difficulty accessing training for long periods of time. This is a coherent system for both workers and employers in so much that it's very transparent as a model. Everybody who is participating, whether it's an employer who is trying to extract trained workers from the system or workers who are trying to enter the system to access training, understand fully what the values and principles are. They understand how the system works, and there's a fairly kind of very easy to understand and follow process for accessing this. Ideally, this will increase private and public investment, so it is a model that works well for the private sector. It provides opportunities that can be funded through a variety of mechanisms. So that's just a very brief overview of what the model itself is. If you have additional questions about what the model, what the moving parts of the model are, then certainly the Career Ladders at One guidebook goes a little bit more into depth, and that's available on ESO's website. So at this point, just talking a little bit about the actual 2 phases that we have now completed as pilot sites. Essentially, Essential Skills Ontario was the lead agency from the period of 2013-2014 and then 2014-2015, leading us through the process of the first 2 phases. They, as I've mentioned, partnered with Literacy Link South Central, Literacy Network of Durham Region, and Literacy Northwest. This project so far in the first two phases have really been about determining the receptivity of communities to the model. It's been about introducing the concept in communities and to community groups, about testing the validity of the model for the needs of the community. So at this point we're very much in a developmental stage. or developmental process in terms of investigating the model. And for the specific communities that have been involved, those would include, as I mentioned, the Durham region, the regional municipality of Durham, which is just west of or east of Toronto, specifically the Thunder Bay region in Mid-North Networks area, and then Brant, Haldimand, and Norfolk in Literacy Link South Central's area. So these pilots have really taken place in a kind of a geographically specific way so far. The first phase of the project was really an overview or an introduction of the Career Ladders model in each community. That being said, we actually accomplished quite a bit in terms of trying to determine whether there was some interest, whether there was the feasibility or the possibility of offering this as a fulsome model in the future. So in order to sort of determine that or gauge that interest, we, as 3 pilot sites, looked at things like the best practices in comparable jurisdictions. So Essential Skills Ontario provided a variety of examples of how Career Ladders was working in other communities, especially in the United States. Accompanied with this was a fairly sophisticated communication mechanism that was developed by Essential Skills Ontario. So we had a research brief and model papers that were developed for us to use and to kind of leverage in each community. The first work that the pilot sites got involved in was really to sort of introduce the concept and to meet with stakeholders and individuals in each community to determine whether they were aware of the model, and then to inform them of what the key aspects were, what sorts of objectives and principles would be met, how this model would fit with community development objectives in a community. Some of the work that got underway once the introduction had taken place was really to introduce the concept of a working group, or what we called an independent planning group. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second. But the assembly of those support groups or working groups was a key piece of the first phase. We went through the process of carrying out or conducting an environmental scan that included a very tight lens on things like our local labor markets in each pilot site. So a great deal of time was spent assembling an overview of what the demographics, the needs, the emerging sectors, the trends, the training climate, and some of the feedback that we mobilized from the independent planning groups. That environmental scan became sort of a platform document that assisted each community in determining the next steps for Career Ladders. We used the information from those environmental scans to establish what we would refer to as sort of criteria, or kind of a platform for selecting an industry. So the data that we extracted from the environmental scan assisted each community in determining what kind of industry did we think that we could support. From there, we looked at additional aspects of the industry, for instance, occupational progression. We looked at growth, the receptivity of the sector to the model. So those are the pieces that flowed out of that. And the end part of our first phase was really to look at developing a bit of a service plan, a bit of a move forward document that would assist us in approaching the next phase of development work. And then the final outcome of the first phase was the Career Ladders at One guidebook. So to kind of, in a nutshell, sort of say where we were at the end of phase 1, it was really determining, was this possible in each community, and if each community was going to structure a career ladder, what sort of sector or what sector choice were we going to make about that? The key guiding body for each career ladder of the pilot phases has been supported by what we would call an independent planning group. And each network assembled one in their community using different mechanisms. So one of the things that I will say about career ladders is that the way you approach it in each community is very independent to the needs and the flavor and the trends of a community. So each site or each pilot site sort of approached assembling their integrated planning group slightly differently. In some cases, existing training and employment groups or committees were leveraged or used to form the foundation, or were used to mine individuals for a group. In other communities, there was more of a brokering approach where the planning group was assembled based on who could mobilize knowledge, information, and relationships within their particular organization. And at the end of the day, each of the 3 pilot groups ended up with a planning group that sort of included the same array of services. That included local planning boards or workforce planning boards, employment services, workforce development, or other types of sector groups, literacy and basic skills agencies, people from municipal government, whether they were from economic development and whatnot, community college staff, faculty, deans, people in registrar. Local chambers of commerce in some case were pulled in for that intelligence or information on sector needs or local workforce needs. Ontario Works, social planning or social development councils, and as I mentioned, economic development groups. So what each member brought to the table was their overview of training needs in the community and workforce development needs in the community based on where they were sitting. And like I said, each pilot site took a slightly different approach to developing that committee, but each committee ended up having sort of the same type of people attached to it. One of the key objectives of the committee was to develop a sense of what came out of the environmental scan and then to start to decide how were you going to choose a sector and industry. So we used the environmental scan and we looked at things like employment rates, poverty trends and information, other types of workforce and economic indicators, and future growth. So again, each community approached their selection slightly differently using the same sorts of demographic information, but all went about it in a different way. And at the end of the day, the 3 communities chose the following industries. So in the region of Durham, food processing, and later this sort of shifted to agri-food, agritourism, and agriculture as well as food processing. And the bullet points sort of indicate the key pieces of information that informed our decision. So we were looking at population growth. We were looking at whether the particular community of Durham had growth potential that was going to impact workforce needs. We looked at age cohorts, so what was going on with youth. And then basically post-secondary credentials. And these were the same for each community. So in Durham, we looked at, our population was growing about 10% between each census year. We were looking at a higher proportion of youth cohorts and about 36% of our population without post-secondary credentials or secondary credentials. In Literacy Northwest, the specific sector selected was retail. That, again, the details of the sectors in the sector selection are in the Career Ladders at 1 documents. But again, Thunder Bay looked at the declining census population. They had an older age cohort that would impact their sector selection. And again, within roughly the same percentage of post-secondary, not having post-secondary credential. And then Literacy Link South Central chose food processing as well. Again, similar types of data looked at in terms of growth on average of 4% between each census year. Again, an older age population than, for instance, in Durham, but similar to Thunder Bay, and a higher adult population that did not have a post-secondary credential. So these are the models that took us each to selecting our sector. So once the first phase was over, we began to look at the likelihood of being able to advance the work that we had collected. And at this point, the second phase was developed. And the objectives around the second phase are really around trying to operationalize some of the knowledge that we had gleaned from the first phase and starting to put it into practice in terms of how would we engage employers, how would we reach out to individuals, how would we sell the concept of career ladders in each community, and what sorts of pieces of information were missing from our array of intelligence gathered in the first phase. So at this point, some of the activities and deliverables that were determined to be necessary to complete the second phase, and again, our last year spent in Career Ladders has really, again, been developmental and investigative as opposed to actually the delivery of training. This is where we moved away from selecting sectors to looking at what types of community training or training assets existed or needed to be filled in each community in order to meet the needs of the selected sector. So if you're doing retail, if you're doing food processing or agriculture, what training exists to support that? What training needs to be brought into the community to make that more compatible with the needs of employers? The second phase was where we began to look at engaging service providers and employers. Again, each community was in a slightly different place in terms of outreach to community and employer stakeholders. So we approached that in a very individualistic way, a very subjective way in each community based on relationships, trends, and information that we had. But at this point, we really needed to start speaking to people and collecting information as well as informing them of the project. Looking at how to support existing services in a career ladder model. So how would we utilize existing community and wraparound services to meet the needs of a fulsome career ladders model? So if you're going to offer career ladders, it's not enough to just offer the training and to have that link to employment or to sector needs. It really needs to be a wraparound approach where individuals get dropout counseling, retention support. They're getting mental health, food and housing security needs met as well. So it's very highly adaptive to the needs of the group that are working, but you need to ensure that those existing services are there and that those services can be adapted or modified for the needs of career ladders. We looked at designing what we would call training asset maps that sort of lay out what the sector training needs were. But this was also an exercise in engaging our local training providers to determine who was willing to actually move forward with potentially adapting curriculum to meet the needs of career ladders. We began to secure commitments from not necessarily employers at this phase, but from service providers. So again, who was willing to participate in the future and who would be willing to adapt service, that becoming a key piece of how you design the delivery of career ladders. We began to assess the resources that could be marshaled to support training activities in the community, whether they be governmental, private sector, or project-based. Each community developed a full implementation plan, and we wrote the second Career Ladders Guide. So the first thing that I would like to sort of go over in terms of the second phase activities is the community training asset map. So this was very much an exercise that took up a good portion of the second phase, and it was more than just looking at what training is available. First of all, we were looking at, again, sector-specific training. So once you had designed or determined what your sector was going to be in your pilot community, you needed to determine what were the training needs that are attached to that. So each community went through the process of determining first and foremost what training is attached to this sector. And as you can see from the asset map tool, the headings that we were looking at was, basically who offers it, what kind of a program or service was it. These programs and services could actually be employment service related, so it may be soft skills training as well as actual hard curricular training. The program or type of service, was it community-based? Was it employment services, community college, post-secondary, apprenticeship? So what type of program or service? The delivery mode, obviously we wanted to know if there was flexibility or adaptability built into delivery modes of particular types of training. The program duration, entrance requirements, any credentials that were issued, and again, this gets into future phase activities where we have to determine, can we restructure credentialed training so that it is chunked into smaller, more manageable pieces for working individuals. We looked at subsector and job-specific focus. So again, we want to match the training with the particular employment needs or occupational needs of a sector. So if it's retail, then how does this training relate to, or what type of job does it relate to in the sector? And then we made some effort to try to attach this to NOC codes or occupational classification. That didn't always prove to be a straightforward or simple a process, but there was some value in trying to investigate whether we could attach occupational classification to some of the training. I think each community would suggest that they found this to be a fairly valuable opportunity to assess what training was offered in each area. So, were people offering food processing curriculum? In some cases, for instance, in my community, training that ended up on the asset map was not even necessarily training that was being delivered. In some cases, it was training that had been developed, but there was no particular market for it, but it may be related to a sector need. So it was good to see not only what was the delivery, what was being delivered in a community, but what was available in the community and not necessarily being delivered at the time, but could be pulled for the purposes of career ladders. The other aspect of training asset mapping was to look at what training is required for the sector but is not available in the community. So again, I can speak to my experience of looking at agri-food or agriculture and looking at the need for knife skills or introduction to butchery, and knowing that there's a wholesale butchery apprenticeship available in Ontario, but there are very few people signed up and very few colleges offering that training. So we put that into the asset map to say, this is the type of training related to the sector, but it isn't being offered in this community. So that was also an important thing to identify. So if we look at what kind of results came out of that training asset map, we determined a few lessons learned at this juncture. The first one was that in order for the training to successfully meet the needs of occupations, it really needs to be partnership-based. This is for the benefit of the employer and the individual taking the training, but also in terms of resource marshaling. You want to find deliverers who are willing to share facilities, curriculum, resources, and instructional responsibilities. So the partnership aspect of training delivery became very important. What we found through our investigation was that one program may be offering one aspect of sector training and another is offering, kind of a complementary basic skills piece. You need these people to work together to create a fulsome career ladder models or career ladder model delivery. We needed to ensure that the essential skills or literacy and basic skills and employment readiness aspects were available in the community, that the capacity for the community to design or develop or adapt that is there, and that it can be integrated with whatever training is going to be offered through career ladders. We wanted to ensure that in addition to the training, we had suitable wraparound supports, specifically related to retention. The individuals who would be attracted to a career ladders model are the most at-risk individuals. They would require, I think we would all agree, much more invested time spent assisting them through the training process. So they need things like retention counseling, but in a much more hands-on, a much more intensive way than perhaps you would find in a typical adult education setting. We know that in each college sector universities, they very often have retention counseling, but this goes a bit above and beyond that to something that's a little bit more intensive. We wanted to look at the opportunity to chunk large credentials into small certificates or increments, and this is where we needed to sort of put a bit of focus on the fact that these types of decisions can't necessarily be made at a community level. Some of the issues around diplomas and certification may actually be at the hands of the Ministry of Training, or maybe at the hands of an individual college or the college sector. So it's something worth noting that we need to include post-secondary training, but whether credentials or diplomas can be stacked in the way that we need them to be, that piece of work needed to be, still needs to be undertaken. And finally, we wanted to look at the readiness or commitment of training institutions in our communities. So it's great that a training provider is offering sector-specific training, but do they have an innovative approach to their work that make them a good, viable partner to support the career ladders model? So really at the end of the process, what we had determined of, what's available, what's not available, and we had started to develop a sense of what training practitioners might be interested in supporting. So, in each community you would get a sense, you would begin to get a sense of who really wants to support the model, or who wants to go through the change steps required to actually do this type of delivery. And before you can start to build a career ladders model that's functioning, you really need to know who's going to be willing to go through the process of change that's involved with amending curriculum. The other outcome or deliverable that we accomplished in the second phase of the project was to develop an implementation plan. So what we really were hoping to achieve was not necessarily to have a full pilot operating at the end of the second phase, but could we get as close as we could to planning out what that might look like in a third or a fourth phase. So each community really looked at what needs to go into an implementation plan. If you're going to deliver career ladders, what are the pieces that have to be addressed? So each community developed a plan based on a template that included fairly specific things that could be used in the manner of a mini grant or kind of an RFP for proposals or a response to proposals for people or funders who might be interested in supporting it. So some of the sections that each of the implementation plans included would be obviously the whole rationale around the sector selection. So what was your sector and why did you choose the sector? And then pulling back into focus, what are the aspects of the sector that really need to be identified through training? So in the case of agri-food or agriculture, you have a great deal of activity in the community, but you don't have and you have a lot of designed training, but not a lot of training being delivered, and not a lot of training being delivered in a workplace-friendly manner. So we sort of charted that out as an introduction to implementation. The communities started to look back at their environmental scans, and through discussion that took place with employers, in some cases employers, in some cases service providers, or people who had intelligence about the workforce needs in their community, we started to assemble candidate profiles or target populations. So if you're going to address the needs of the working poor, where do those individuals reside? So what are their specific wraparound needs? How far away from employment are they? Are they Ontario Works dependent? Do they have particular extraneous needs that haven't been addressed yet by the community? What sorts of things are you going to have to accommodate in terms of their, kind of their situational aspects? In the United States, where you're looking at more robust models, you might find that Career Ladders is focused around Hispanic populations or specific groups of individuals who need assistance to access training. In each of our pilot communities, we didn't necessarily become so focused on designing, kind of a very, very specific group, but we did start to make decisions around, will these people be unemployed, or will they be the working poor who are already attached to a sector? And in some communities, it may be both. You may have recipients who are on Ontario Works, or you have unemployed recipients who need a boost up in order to access employment, and conversely, you might have individuals who are, for instance, agricultural, working in the agriculture sector as pickers, or working in fruit sorting, and have very little access to further employment opportunities in the sector. So they are not going to be able to become a shift supervisor. They don't have high school. So we started to look at, who are our candidates going to be in each community, and how are we going to meet their particular needs. We had mapped out the training aspects, but we also looked to the employers of our sectors and started to ask questions around occupational progression. So what would be a first rung training offering that we could do? So if you're doing retail, what does that first pilot training look like? What is the rudimentary or basic first introduction to retail that you need to be offering in terms of training? And then what would be some of the progressions? What would be some of the next rungs on that ladder? So we began to sift out what that would look like. Again, we went back to our community training assets and the results of those asset plans and wrote those into the implementation plan to describe what types of training providers would be participating, what types of training opportunities would be available in each community. And then we sort of mapped out what the pilot might look like, what would be a memorandum of understanding, what aspects would be dealt into those types of contractual arrangements. What would the model design look like? Are you talking about distance training? Would it be computer-based? Would it be in-class? Would it be itinerant? What would be the timelines? And again, starting to look at things like budget and financial requirements. So who might be interested in supporting this from a financial or grant aspect, which of course is the big kind of leading question to our next or future phases of career ladders. And finally, the implementation plan sort of described what the next steps or move forward in each community would be. So as I've mentioned several times, this obviously followed the same template in each community, but each community came to the information in different ways that were specific to their, to their needs, their sectors, and their community trends. And each plan looked a little different, which was interesting to see at the end of the project. At the end of the second phase, having completed the training asset maps and then looking at developing an implementation plan for each community, we came up with a couple of key lessons learned. And I think, these are probably universals to any type of concept that you're trying to introduce to a community. So the first one is the people who are involved in career ladders, your partners, your supporters, employers, community-based supporters, they have to actually want to do something new or innovative. So they have to be able to see the problems in your community that can be solved through career ladders, but there has to be some will to embrace innovation and change. The model of career ladders can be transformative in a community, but it's not something that would probably lend itself well to sort of tepid engagement by people who don't necessarily see it as kind of a game changer. And in most of the communities, I think people came around to seeing career ladders as something that is radically different from what is being offered in the community right now. Your partnerships have to be authentic. There has to be a sense that the people coming to the table to support career ladders really believe in the initiative, they believe in the concept and the principles, and they want to lead the project based on those principles. And so there has to be a fairly transparent attachment to what career ladders brings to a community. Again, it's not just another training solution. It requires a great deal more commitment to values and to offering a model in a way that is fairly true to its initial purpose, which is to meet the needs of the working poor, the disengaged from employment. As much as you want to plan out an initiative, we've learned that it's probably more about building relationships, which means that this can be a bit of a messy process. It's not necessarily as straightforward as just, you build the model, you assemble it, and then you roll it out in the community, and it effortlessly meets the needs of any number of people. It's heavily related to the development of relationships, the building up of goodwill, kind of trust and investment by employers. So you have to be able to answer people's questions, and you have to be able to understand their needs. One of the lessons that kind of came, that sort of attached to this, is time and time again in my own community, we would be speaking with employers, and they would ask us questions like, if I train someone, what if one of my competitors takes that person? So this whole issue of poaching, if I train this person, they might leave and work for someone else and take my training investment with them. So it's listening to those concerns and developing innovative solutions, because you're building relationships with people, and your credibility is important when you're building relationships, especially with employers. And I think the biggest piece is that failures are part of the process. This is not, the sort of initiative that probably lends itself well to wanting to keep your hands clean. It's sort of something that you have to get, it can be messy to assemble a career ladders. And what we're finding now is that without being sure where we're moving towards supportive funding, we're going to need to try things on, and all of those initiatives may not work out. So you're going to take some risks in your community, and you're going to find that things don't always happen in a way that you were hoping. And finally, when we're looking at having developed the second phase, the lessons learned sort of led into some key recommendations that were developed at the end and have been published in the second guidebook now. One of the concerns that we have is that the need for stable long-term funding is an absolute. The 3 pilot sites have gone through 2 phases of development, but it can take between 3 and 7 years to assemble a career ladders model that's fulsome and that's secure. There's a great deal of more work to be done in each pilot area before we actually got to the stage of delivering training. And at this time, it's not sure where that stable long-term funding might come from. Employer engagement is something that is really, on one hand, very difficult to manage, and is absolutely crucial to the project. But more than that, you have to be able to manage employers' expectations. So there's always the tension of when do you go to employers and seek their feedback, or when do you go and present them with a concept when you don't necessarily have anything to offer them in terms of imminent delivery. So each pilot site had to kind of go through that process. And what we're saying is that you have to have a tangible offering. Sometimes that is just kind of partnership building, but absolutely you have to know what you're presenting to employers and what it is that you're asking of them, or what you're offering them when you go through that process. We certainly need to look at how Career Ladders fits in with other training and employment initiatives or grants. So for instance, how would the Canada-Ontario Jobs Grant apply to these types of initiatives or the Career Ladders model? What other types of foundations, funding opportunities, what other types of employment service offerings would be impacted by Career Ladders? And how can you leverage those existing programs or grants or services? Future wide-scale adaptations, so moving the model beyond just the three pilot sites, is going to require post-secondary providers to look at how they issue certification or diplomas. So what we want to see is whether the training that we would like to offer can be chunked or stacked into actual diplomas or certificates. And if colleges or universities have a stake in that, then we need to find a way of articulating with them whether they're going to accept that type of change. And that's certainly much bigger than the 3 pilot sites or Essential Skills Ontario. Those decisions have much more broader implication. And finally, it would be really great if we could leverage provincial sector councils or groups that are already kind of assembled. This might be, there are food processing groups or sectors, there's retail councils. So it would be good to be able to connect with those provincial bodies to make the process of developing training a little easier. You could save a lot of time and energy in each community if you were provincially attached to sector groups or employment councils and that sort of thing. So we would like to see the kind of the provision of more dialogue with those sector groups. At this point, I'd sort of like to turn it over to general questions or a generic discussion. I'd also like to invite Tamara and Stuart to sort of maybe sum up any points of note in their own communities that I may have missed.
Hi, Janine.
Yes.
Sorry, I just got kicked off of my sound there for a second. So Stuart and Tamara, you guys are unmuted if you have anything to add to Janine's presentation. And just to one thing. Just let everybody know that if you do have any questions about the presentation, just to type them in your question pane. I do have a few questions here now, but just to give everybody the heads up, just to type in your questions. Go ahead, Stuart, sorry.
Very quickly, one of the things I think we found at all the sites, because we suspect that there will be issues around literacy and essential skills, but we can't be too blunt about that with employers. They don't have a strong recognition of the importance of that, and we're also pretty sure that if we come on too strong in terms of assessment and developing skills, that we're going to scare off our clients. So the strategy going forward would be to create programming that embeds the literacy and essential skills in components of the program without ever calling it such. And so integration of it within the program, but trying as much as possible to stay away from talking about basic skills or literacy skills in order for it to actually get integrated in the program.
And this is Tamara. So if I could just add that what we found is, if through going through the career ladder process, phase 1 and phase 2, is that although we've been involved in literacy service planning for a very long time, this takes service planning at a community level to a whole new realm. You're looking at including a lot more partners around the table, each of whom has their own perspective, perhaps their own agenda, their own way of looking at system delivery and system construction. So that's where I think the time and the energy comes in, is to try to negotiate all of those different expectations with one goal in mind. And that goal being meeting the needs of employers, which is a slightly different lens. Although we're very employment focused in literacy and basic skills, as Janine alluded to earlier, one of our big takeaways as a pilot is you really need to have your ducks in a row before you go out knocking on those employer doors. Because when you try to engage employers, there's a need to be very, very responsive. They don't really enjoy it if you say things like, well, I'll take that back to the committee and I expect we'll have a decision on that in 3 months. So it really cements for me the need for coordination at the local level so that you can keep all the partners involved who need to be involved, because you're looking at a very diverse group sitting around the table.
Perfect, thank you. So I do have a few questions here. First question, and I'll open it up to any of the three of you. When do you see, or how do you see this model catching on in other parts of Ontario?
This is Janine speaking. That's a really interesting question because we've had the benefit of development support over the last 2 years, and honestly, it's difficult to get this work done without supportive funding. So I think it will catch on perhaps in communities where there's already a keen interest in the model, and also where there might be opportunity for sign up this partnership supporter funding as well. It's very difficult to say now that we're kind of moving to an unfunded portion of the project how that's going to look.
I would just add that what we've learned in 2 years with this project can certainly be brought to another community, and that community could fast track to where we are now. It's taken us 2 years to find our way here, but moving into, for example, other northern communities, we could expedite the process very quickly and get to the stage we are right now and be ready should funding appear to expand the model more broadly.
It's Tamara here, and I would just add to that certainly employer need would be a huge driver in implementing a successful career ladder. If there's an industry in a particular pocket of the province where employers are struggling to get the people that they need to operate their businesses, I think that would facilitate a career ladder being developed. Not all aspects of it, but it would be a very important ingredient.
Okay, perfect. The next question is, how do you see career ladders integrating into the provincial data recording system?
So I'm assuming that's the EIOS camps?
Probably.
I'm not sure.
Well, I think that if employment service providers are involved heavily within, involved in recruiting and working with workers to move them and help them make the transition, then that may become part of their reporting through employment services. But that's the only link I can see at the moment.
Well, from my perspective, it's Tamara. One of the things that we talked about as a local community was how important it was for us to see some of the individuals who are currently within literacy and basic skills programs move into a sustainable type of employment that has future career options. So when we talk about a career ladder, we talk about the first rung as being the one that will probably encompass literacy and basic skills, like getting people onto that first rung of an employment ladder. So all of those individuals I could see in certain communities going through some sort of industry-specific programming that has literacy and essential skills at its base, and they would all be candidates for EOIS CAMS. So.
Okay. Can you please tell us a little bit more about what you mean by chunked or stacked?
Oh, sure. Essentially what career ladders is rather than an individual having to complete, for instance, a 2-year community college diploma in any particular domain. So we can say, I don't know, let's say Boilermaker. You take individuals who need to have immediate employment, so people who can't take 2 years out of their life to go to college to become a Boilermaker, and you take that certificate or diploma and you chunk it into smaller course offerings. So instead of going to school for 2 years, you may go to school while you're working on a part-time basis for a couple of weeks here and there, so nights and weekends for 8 weeks, for instance, or part-time out of the workforce for 8 weeks, and you get a level 1 certificate towards your Boilermaker's diploma. So you do this and move your way up the ladder until you've attained your certificate or credential. Was that, hopefully that was fairly...
I think so.
If I could just mention, sorry,
No, go ahead.
I think that chunking could also include literacy and basic skills, because right now what happens is we would, for some clients, we would provide upgrading so that they could move on, say, to the post-secondary stream, or we do upgrading so they can get a GED and go into that post-secondary program. But I think what some career ladders could look like is that first rung could involve a combination of upgrading and industry-specific training. Right? So that way, that's the sort of chunking that we're talking about. So they're already getting that slight immersion into a particular industry that is in demand in their community, and without having to sort of do their upgrading. And then, as Janine said, because upgrading itself could take up to a year for some individuals, and then have to go to a post-secondary program.
Yeah, and I would, Stuart, I would add that prior learning assessment is a huge component. The college program up in Thunder Bay is it's quite possible to have prior learning assessed and get credit for big chunks of that business program based on vast business experience that someone may have. And this would probably apply to an older person, but who's actually been working for a while. But that then fast tracks the individual to completion of a diploma by exempting them from a whole bunch of the credits. Now, there'll be a fee for that, but it's quite reasonable.
Okay, I have another question here. How do you think career ladders and the Canada Ontario Jobs Grant could fit together?
Who wants to take this one?
Tamara, you want to?
Yeah.
I'll certainly start it, but I mean, again, as Judy mentioned a few times during the presentation, we're a little bit stuck at the moment at the community level because there isn't any additional financial support at this time. So one of the things that, because we're very creative in literacy and basic skills, we're thinking, well, how else can we still pursue some level of career ladder approach? And this is where the Canada-Ontario Job Grants come in, because if you have employers who are interested in training, they of course can go to the employment service providers, and through enhanced service planning at the local level, we're hoping that we can identify those employer training needs, and if we have chunked learning available, then we can segue people from those companies into the training and potentially help them move up. So what this does is, we know that the Canada-Ontario Jobs Grant is primarily, although not exclusively, for people who are employed. But if those people who maybe are occupying entry-level positions move up the ladder, then there are more entry-level positions available. And I see that as a win potentially for the Employment Ontario system, because we have people that we want to place within those entry-level positions. Does that help?
Yeah, I would add to that too that there's probably longer term support available for higher rung training. So you may not be able to flow people into the training through, through Canada Ontario Jobs Grant initially because they're unemployed. But as they develop employment opportunities and they want to access higher level training, then that also might be a viable way of supporting them. It may not work for entry, for people entering the system, but it could work for higher ups.
Okay, perfect. So the next question, so if I understand correctly, you are now entering into the unfunded phase of this. How do you see that working? Is the participant paying for some of the training or employers?
I think in each community when we were developing our implementation plan, we knew that we didn't have a funded portion coming up. So we each sort of designed a couple of different options. I think the true answer is that we actually don't know for sure how this is going to work. But we have kind of a sense of, could this be sponsored through grants or foundations? Are there other governmental agencies or incoming funds that might be supportive to this? Are there things like Canada Ontario Jobs Grant? Certainly in my community we did talk a little bit about whether this could be employer-sponsored training or, is there any opportunity for fee-for-service? It will really depend. I mean, we're working with a target group that are at risk, so the likelihood of individuals accessing training being able to pay is very, very minimal, but that doesn't preclude social services from potentially having a role to play in terms of funding or supporting training. So I think at this point we don't have clear answers. We have a lot of leads but no no absolute pathway to follow.
Yeah, and it's Stuart here. I think what we've established in our community is the potential to proceed, and we've got partners ready to proceed. And in fact, the beauty of Career Ladders is that it engages many of the community service providers who are already doing a large part of this Career Ladders thing, like assessment and connecting them to work and helping kids plan and that sort of stuff. So if the switch gets, turned to fire it up, then we'll focus a little more directly on creating those plans and recruiting people. But practically speaking, a lot of the activity currently exists within the system. It's just a way of reframing it if we get some funding to make it more engaging and more active.
And it's Tamara here. So from our perspective, we would like to move ahead, and I think we will move ahead, but I think it was Janine who mentioned earlier the idea of scalability, right? So where we might have wanted to go forward with, our best plan, that would be ideal, where we could focus on outcomes and evaluation. If there's no additional funding, it'll be a much pared back scale that we will have to proceed with. So it doesn't mean that there isn't still interest at the community level. It would be disappointing at this point in time after all the investment that is put into it. But like I said, literacy folks are resilient, so I don't think we're ready just to throw it up in the air because there is no guarantee of funding at this time.
Okay, sounds good. So that's all the questions that we had for today. So if there are any follow-up questions for Janine or Tamara or Stuart, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recorded webinar. And if that's okay with you three, I'll include your email addresses just if people have any follow-up questions. And the follow-up will also have a link to fill out a quick survey to let us know how we did on today's webinar. And if you fill out the evaluation, you have a chance to win a $50 gift card to Indigo. So I'll be sending that out later this afternoon. So unless there are any other final comments, we will end here for the day. And I just wanted to thank Janine and Tamara and Stuart for hosting the webinar for us today. I think it went really well and very engaging with everyone's questions. So thank you to you three for hosting that for us today. And
Thank you very much.
and we will see everybody at the next webinar.
Great. Thank you very much, Amber.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.